on Monday, the 2nd of October 2006. Charles Roberts had just finished eating breakfast with his family. He was married and he had 3 young children. He kissed his wife goodbye as she left and took their 3 children to school. He reached into his bag and he brought out 4 envelopes addressed to each member of his family and placed them on the kitchen table. It was 4 suicide notes. He picked up 4 guns and he picked up his equipment and he packed it all into his truck as he headed to the local Amish school. As he drove there, he realized he'd arrived a bit too early than he'd planned. And so he got a drink from the public vending machine and stood and watched the children playing. 26 children aged between 6 and 13 attended this small Amish school. He drank his drink as he waited for them to go back inside. When they went back inside, he got back into his truck and he drove up to the school. He took out his bag and his equipment, took out one of his guns and entered into the school. He was only after the girls, so he told all the boys that they needed to leave. He told the adults there to leave as well, and he barricaded himself in with 10 girls aged between 6 and 13. By now, the community was alarmed and people started to gather around, and the police had been called and they surrounded at the school. At 11:05, 30 minutes after he'd entered the school, he lined up 10 girls and he shot all 10 of them. And then he turned the gun on himself and shot himself. 5 of the girls died. Eventually, 5 of them got to hospital and they recovered. The whole of the world's media were shocked and descended on this little hamlet, shocked at the behavior of Charles Robert, who would gun down 10 girls in cold blood. But then the world's media got a greater shock, because the Amish community was soaked in the way of Jesus. At about 11:05, the girls were shot. Later that day, 3 members of the Amish community went hunting for Amy, Charles Roberts' widow. They went to her house and she wasn't there, and they went to the grandfather's house and she wasn't there either, and eventually they went to her father's house and found her there, and they turned up at the door. The father answered the door and said, "We've just come to see Amy. We just want to offer our condolences. We just want to say, we forgive you." You see, what the Amish community realized is that that family had lost a father, and they'd lost a husband, and they'd lost their privacy, and they were about to be dumped with a whole load of shame. At a similar time, another guy from the Amish community went looking for the killer's father, and eventually he found the killer's father at home. And when they knocked on the door, when he answered, he hugged him for an hour and just kept saying, "We forgive you, we forgive you." In the days following the shooting, the widow's family just had this flood of gifts, floods of meals, floods of visitors from the Amish community offering their condolences. And they said, "We hope you stay here because you've got support here and you've got friends here." When it came to the killer's funeral, there was 75 people at his funeral. Half of those were from the Amish community. And the funeral director who watched the funeral take place, and as he looked at the graveside and the widow and her 3 little children said goodbye to their father, to their husband, as he watched the Amish community come up and hug her and offer their condolences and offer their support, he said, "This is a moment I will never forget." And he looked at what's happening and he said, "I've seen a real miracle." The world's media was totally shocked at the killing. They were even more shocked at the Amish community's response. The Amish community was surprised that anybody would be shocked because they were just soaked in the way of Jesus. I don't know why God allowed Charles Robert to gun down 10 young girls. I don't know why God is allowing suffering to enter your life, whatever you're facing, whatever you have faced, whatever's wrecking your life at the moment, whatever wounds you carry from things that have happened in the past. I don't know why God has allowed that. But I do know that there's a better question to ask. There's a much better question to ask than just, why am I facing this? Why am I going through this? And the better question is this: how am I going to go through this? Given that I've got to face this, given that this has happened, given this is in front of me, how am I going to walk through this? And a better question is, what resources and what tools are available to you to enable you to walk through the darkest times? What resources and what tools are available to you? Depending on what your view of life is, what you believe in, who you trust, you will have various resources and tools available to you. My experience of leading and supporting people through suffering and walking through suffering myself is that the way of Jesus offers an abundance of resources and tools to lead you through suffering that is better than any other approach that you could take. There's nothing that competes with the way of Jesus for what resources and tools are available to you. And there'll be some of you here, there's kind of three groups here this morning, really. There's those of you who are walking through suffering right now. And I just want to offer you some tools this morning from the way of Jesus that will help you right now. There'll be people here, and you're not really sure what you believe. You're not sure about the whole Jesus thing and the church thing. And I just want to give you an insight that if you committed to following Jesus, this is the sort of thing that he does in your life. And as a third group, life is just great. And God bless you, life is just great. But I want you to listen to these tools, because not everybody has a suffering-proof faith. Some people have faith in Jesus and their life's great, but when suffering comes, their faith crumbles and it's brittle. So I want you to listen this morning so that you've got a suffering-proof faith. So when it comes, it doesn't fall apart. And we're going to look at a story in John chapter 11. We're going to look at a story from Jesus. And we're going to look at kind of three resources that this story tells us that the way of Jesus can offer us. And right at the beginning of John chapter 11, it begins with devastating news. Jesus gets two messengers that come to him, and they say this to Jesus, and they say, Jesus, the one that you love is ill. The one that you love, they're talking about Lazarus, who's really close to Jesus, said, the one you love is ill. And by that, they don't mean that he's got man flu, they mean that he's close to death. The one that you love is nearly dead. And so Jesus does nothing for 2 days. They send help to Jesus, say, the one that you love is nearly dead, and Jesus does nothing for 2 days. Sometimes you can be facing pain and suffering, and you cry out to Jesus, and you ask him to do something, and it feels like for days he just does nothing. You're not alone if that is your experience. And then Jesus says this. He said, this illness, this serious illness will not end in death. It's going to be for God's glory. This serious illness is not going to result in death. It's for God's glory. And this is the first resource, this is the first tool, really, that we get offered in the way of Jesus. He's saying it's not going to result in death. Actually, it's going to result in something else. It's going to result in God's glory. What that means is it's going to result in you seeing something that you've never seen before. You're going to get a sense of the goodness of God. You're going to get a sense of life. You're going to see something. For your benefit, something's going to come out of this experience. And the first resource the way of Jesus offers when we are walking through suffering is this, that we get an invitation from Jesus to discover a greater purpose through our pain and suffering. Because God is over all things, because God is in all things. He's not just in the good times. God's very present in the bad times. He wants you to discover a greater purpose through what is happening. I once applied for a job at the Joshua Tree charity, just based in Cheshire. And the Joshua Tree charity works with families who have a child facing cancer. And it was really interesting applying for the job and finding all about Joshua, because the charity was started by Joshua's family, because Joshua got cancer. And the family realized there wasn't enough support for families who had a child with cancer. And so they decided to start one because they thought there wasn't enough support. And so they have this experience where their child faced cancer, and from that they realized there wasn't enough support. So they started one. And so out of their suffering, they have now held hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families. Out of pain and suffering, God wants you to discover a greater purpose. Suffering brings the greatest songs. It brings the greatest heroes. Suffering brings the greatest movements. Think of any examples, and they're birthed in suffering. That there's amazing things that can come out of suffering that can't come any other way. And when I've walked through suffering, I've sensed God saying to me, I want you to discover a greater purpose here. And the greatest purpose might be He wants to shape your character. The greatest purpose is He wants you to understand suffering in a way that you've not understood it before. He wants you to understand God's presence and His power in a way that you've not understood it before. He wants you to have an ability to actually bless others more because of your suffering rather than less. There's a lot of amazing things that can come out of suffering. And when you're walking through suffering, when something happens and hits you, you think there's only two options. When you're in that moment, and maybe you've lost a loved one, or you've had a miscarriage, or your wife walks out on you, or you get made redundant, or there's a financial problem, when that hits you, in that moment, you imagine there's only two options, and you're thinking, am I going to survive this, or is this going to break me? In that moment, you think, these are the two options. Is it going to break me, or am I going to survive it? And I hope that I survive it. And Jesus says, actually, they're not the only two options. It's not just, is this going to break you, or are you going to survive this? He said, there's another option. Can you come out of this greater than you were before it? And God just doesn't want you to survive it. He doesn't want to just prevent it breaking you. He wants you to come out even greater. That's the possibility of what suffering can do. Charles Roberts' family, as they talked about the Amish community and what they did, they were like, if this happened in any other community, if this didn't happen to the Amish community, then actually it would have ripped a community apart. If you had one family that went into a school and gunned down, it would rip a family apart if it was anybody else. He said, but what you've done, they said to the Amish community, because of the way you've treated us, we've been able to find healing. Because of what you've done for us, the Roberts family, Amy and her kids and her parents said, we've been able to find freedom. We've been able to find a way to lift this burden off us. And they said to the Amish community, even greater than that, actually, you are changing the world. As a little community, your response is changing the world, because there's people in London writing about forgiveness. There's people in New York that are writing about what you've done. There's people asking about what should you do with suffering? What's this way of Jesus all about? You are changing the world in a way that you couldn't have if it hadn't happened. And our culture wants us to worship pain avoidance and comfort and pleasure. Right? You are soaked in a culture which worships avoiding pain, making things as convenient as possible, and being as comfortable as possible. There's businesses and whole industries, and you know about them, are based around just making us feel a little bit better. And God says, my purposes for you is more than feeling better. My purpose for you is that you become greater. But it requires a choice in suffering for you to cooperate, for you to look for what God's doing and for you to cooperate with that, to think bigger than just surviving, to think bigger than just feeling better. After 2 days of doing nothing, and Jesus saying, God's going to use this for His glory, He eventually heads off to see Lazarus and the family. And as he arrives, Mary and Martha, the two sisters that are really close to Jesus, they come to Him separately and have a conversation with Him. And interestingly, both of them, in separate conversations, say the same thing to Jesus. And this is what they say to Him separately. Both of them said this. They said, God, Lord Jesus, if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Lazarus, he's no longer ill, he's dead. But if you'd been here, Jesus, if only you'd been present, you could have done something. They're heartbroken, and they half blame Jesus. And then Jesus saw the sisters weeping, and it says this: when Jesus saw her weeping, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Then Jesus wept, and he asked to be taken to the tomb, to the grave where they'd buried Lazarus. And when he headed towards there, he was still angry when he got to the tomb. Can you see who John, who records this story, he's trying to emphasize 4 times the deep emotional response of Jesus. There's deep anger, there's tears, there's anger that lasts for a while, it's still there. He's deeply troubled and he's deeply stirred. And sometimes when we get the kind of first tool resource, that God's got a greater purpose, that God's going to work something out even greater, it can feel a bit heartless. We're suffering in pain, and God just wants to make something special happening, as if he's a puppet master or something. We can get the wrong end of the stick, which is why we have this story and we have these verses that John points us to. Because what happens is when we face suffering, when we're struggling, and we say to God, you could have done something. If only you answered my prayer, if only you were here, you could have done something. We imagine that we're standing here and we've got our pain and our suffering, whatever that might be that we're carrying, and it's us and our pain, and we're looking to Jesus and we're saying, you could have done something. If only you'd responded, if only you'd done something. And what this verse says is it's not like that at all. You're not standing with your pain, having a go at Jesus. There's you and Jesus together addressing the pain. And as you're looking at the pain and you're so angry because of what someone's done to you, you're so angry because of your loss, it breaks your heart because of what happened, Jesus is next to you saying exactly the same thing. He's saying, it breaks my heart. I'm so angry at what happened to those 10 girls. He's raging at the evil in the world. And Jesus is right next to you, with you, raging against suffering, against evil, against pain. It's not you and your suffering against him, it's you and him against suffering. And it's not you against God. It's you and with God against pain and against evil and against suffering. And this is exactly what you need when you walk through difficulties. 5 years ago, I'd been married for 22 years. I had 2 kids. And my wife, for various reasons, decided that she was leaving. She was walking out the door. We were not going to be together anymore. I worked full-time leading a church, teaching people, explaining the Bible, role modeling how to follow Jesus, having the little perfect family that you could show everybody what it's like when you follow Jesus. And I had to have a special church meeting, and I invited everyone to come. I said, you need to come, I've got some important news. And it was one of these members' meetings where everybody turned up because there was something big going to get revealed. They didn't know what it was. And I stood up and I had to tell everyone that my wife was going to leave. And as a leader, you felt like your credibility was in tatters. How can I stand up and teach the Bible when I can't even hold my family together? How can I explain the way of Jesus when I'm struggling to do it myself? And as I stood up and hardly got through my statement, I had the shortest statement that took the longest time just to explain to people. Something very strange happened after I told everybody. Rather than my credibility being in tatters, people felt deeply connected to me. I could see it in their eyes. I could see it the way people spoke to me. People had more affection. They had more attention for me. And there was one group in particular that were massively drawn to me and wanted to meet me for coffee. They always wanted to catch me after church. And it was a group who had lost a partner. People who'd either lost a partner through death or had been divorced or suffering or something like that suddenly wanted to spend a lot of time with me. And here's the thing, that when you're suffering, the thing you most want, that most helps, is to find someone else who's had a similar experience. That's why we have support groups. That's why when you've lost a child and you speak to someone with a happy family, you find a disconnect because they just don't know what it's like. But when you speak to someone else who's lost a child, if you're lost a child, there's a connection. You haven't got the same experience, or you're not the same journey, but there's a connection that comes there. And here in this story of Jesus, what we find is Jesus has got a deep connection with us because he knows what it's like, because he's had the same experience as us. Your sense of loss is Jesus' sense of loss. All right? That job, that dream that's fallen apart, that's Jesus' sense of loss. When Jesus is on the cross, all the pain and suffering in the world gets put on him so much that he cries out, God, why have you abandoned me? He's experienced the ultimate loss. And so when we come to God, that actually he's experienced what we've experienced, when we've realized that, it's not us against God, but he's experienced it, he's walked through it, there can be a massive, deep connection. And here's the thing, there's no other faith that offers that. There's no other approach in the world that offers that. You can worship money, but it won't hurt with you. You can follow any other God you want, but you won't find any other God with wounds. You won't find any other God became a human being to experience what you've experienced. Nobody else knows what it's like except Jesus. And that's what I think, that when we walk through pain and suffering, following the way of Jesus is the best option for you. It's got the most resources. It's got the most tools. And so I would encourage you that when you're crying out and you're struggling, it's not to imagine that God's there and you and your pain is here, but imagine you and God are here and you're crying out against your pain. And God doesn't tell you off for crying out. He says, come on, let's be angry. Let's cry out and say, this is not good enough. Let's weep, because he's doing it too. Jesus says, there's going to be a greater purpose through this suffering. God wants to make the situation greater rather than less. He wants to say to Mary and Martha, listen, it's not me against you. We're both together against what's happened. And then Jesus heads out to the grave. And with anger pulsing through his veins, he looks at the stone and he says to them, remove the stone. And in this kind of very dark story, you kind of have this moment of humor, where Martha's like, do you really want to do that, Jesus? Because it's going to stink. Right. And I wonder how often her sister reminded her of in the days past. Do you remember when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and all you were caring about was his body odor? Jesus says, just keep moving it. They moved the stone out. And then Jesus said, I'm going to pray out loud. And I'm going to pray out loud not so God will hear me. I'm going to pray out loud so that you might hear me. Because I want you to hear what's about to happen, because this is actually for your benefit. And he says to Lazarus, he said, Lazarus, I want you to come out. And Lazarus, who was dead, comes alive and comes out. And Jesus says, I'm praying out loud because I want you to know what's going on here. And it's bigger and better than a family being reunited. It's bigger and better than a family being reunited. Jesus says this. He says, I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live. I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live. And when you discover a greatest purpose in your pain and suffering, and you find that you become greater, and you find all these benefits, and you find a deeper sense of God, that's amazing that happens. And when in your suffering you realize that God's not against you, but God's with you, and God's experiencing the pain just as you're experiencing the pain, and you're not alone, and somebody walks with you, that's really therapeutic. It's really fantastic. But sometimes when we hit a great loss, a great suffering, it feels like this is the end. When my wife walked out on me, it was just like, this is just the end of everything. When you get that cancer diagnosis, just like, this is just the end. Right? When you lose a job that's so important, it just feels like the end. And when Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life, he's saying this is not the end. This is not the end. The best is still to come. And as wonderful as it is having Jesus with you against the pain, as wonderful as God having a greatest purpose, actually the best is still to come. And what's still to come is Jesus is going to resurrect your body. That Jesus at the last day is going to raise you up. And the way that Tolkien says is this, that one day everything sad will become untrue. Everything that's sad will become undone. Everything that's bad in this world is going to get redeemed and get changed. There's this picture that God is working towards, that there's an ultimate progress towards. And John, who's the eyewitness of this story, he had a vision, and he wrote a different book at the very end of the Bible. And the second last chapter in the Bible, Revelation 21, has his vision of the future, that this is not the end, but the best is yet to come. And this is what he said we're all heading towards. There will come a day when God's home will be with his people, Revelation 21, that he's going to live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them, and he'll wipe every tear from their eyes. And there will be no more death. One day there'll be no more death. One day there'll be no more sorrow. One day there'll be no more crying. One day there'll be no more pain. All these things will be gone forever. One day all these things will be gone forever. And it says, Jesus speaks in that passage, said, I'm making all things new. Whatever we're going through, it's not the end. The best is yet to come. And no one else offers that. No one else offers the evidence of the resurrected Jesus. Lots of other approaches promise you things might be better, but the way of Jesus offers you the evidence that he's already resurrected, and that's what he offers, a guarantee and a taste of what it will be like. There's 3 groups here this morning. Some of us are walking through suffering pain right now. It might be a wound that you've carried for a long time, but it still hurts. Or there may be something right now that you're really walking through. I want to tell you that the resources from Jesus are the best thing available to you. And what he wants to offer you is to encourage you to make a decision to discover a greater purpose in your pain. Not just to look for comfort, but to look for a greater purpose of knowing him more, of being strengthened in your character, having great empathy of other people who are struggling. He also wants you to be not thinking it's you against him, but he wants to be right with you against the suffering. And kind of underneath all that, he wants you to know that it's not the end, that the future, the best is still to come. And he wants you to meditate and pray on those things and hang on to those things and get all the spiritual power you can from those things. And in a minute, we're going to worship and the band's going to come back up. And if you're in that group who struggle, I want you to encourage just to chew over those things and just pray on those things and meditate on those things. The second group here, and you're not a Christian or you're not religious, you're not sure you're a follower of Jesus, you kind of come to church, you're not sure. I just want to challenge you that when you face suffering, what resources do you have available? Because I want to challenge you to say the way of Jesus is better than anything else out there. And I want to invite you to commit your life to Jesus. You will face challenge and struggle at one day, and what Jesus offers you is better than anything else available. You just need to come to him, offer your life to him. And then a third group who are very happy, life is good, and maybe you've been praying for people you know are suffering, but your life is great. As we worship, I just want you to chew over these 3 truths and maybe just worship through them. Be inspired to worship Jesus through them and invite him to put those truths deeper into your heart so that your faith will become suffering-proof, so that you know what you're going to do when you suffer. You know what your attitude is. You know what your approach is. You know what resources Jesus has got. Let me just pray. And then the band are going to lead us in worship, and we're going to invite Jesus just to minister to us. We're going to invite Jesus just to come and speak to us. We're going to invite Jesus to make this stuff real in our lives. And Jesus, we just want to thank you that you're so real and that you're so human as well as divine. I want to pray for each of us wherever we're at. And we just want to commit this time of worship to you. We just want to invite you to come by your Spirit. And may they not just be nice ideas on a screen, but deep truths that change our heart as we worship. Amen.